can I think of a linking device?
Shall we move on then to The Little Prince?
That's a rubbish linking device. I mean, it's effective, but it's rubbish.
It's a link, not a device.
One of these days, Scott, we'll manage good linking devices for everything. Preferably full of puns, but good would be the main criteria. Like Jason and the Argonauts, Mark Osborne's The Little Prince features stop-motion animation for only a portion of its running time. And, like Jason, it's used as a special effect. But the effect, and why it's special, is very different indeed. Based on the world-famous novella Le Petit Prince by French author and aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince tells the story of a little girl, voiced in English version by Mackenzie Foy, who we first meet as she tries to earn a place at the prestigious Worth Academy, whose goal is to make sure that the children grow up to be essential. Failing her interview, her mother then relocates them to within the school's catchment zone to force them to accept her. But to do this, she has to buy a house whose affordability is, well, afforded by its proximity to the rather ramshackle house next door. In this house, the only one for miles around with any character, lives the Aviator, voiced by Jeff Bridges, an old, eccentric and lonely man whose rather atypical form of greeting his new neighbours is to accidentally smash a hole in their wall with a propeller after he attempts to start his biplane in his back garden. Most people settle for a basket of muffins. The mother isn't overly impressed by this, but the little girl's curiosity finds her drawn to learn more about the Aviator, particularly after he sends her some pages, modelled after Saint-Exupéry's own handwritten manuscript, of a story about a little prince. She enters Aviator's garden, so different from the impeccably manicured but anodyne gardens of all the others in the neighbourhood, and befriends him, listening, enthralled, as he begins to tell her of the prince, his lone life on asteroid B612, his love for a rose, and his adventures across space after he left her. They become fast friends, and even accomplices. But the little girl's, she has no other name, intensive study plan for beginning school starts to suffer, or, rather more accurately, be neglected entirely, until the friendship is forcibly ended by her mother after running with the police. The everyday world of the girl is, in the first two acts, deliberately boring. 3D computer animated in a competent but unremarkable way. Indistinguishable, except in the environs of the Aviator's house, from 100 other films. But the world of the prince is where the magic lies. A beautifully realised stop-motion interpretation of Saint-Exupéry's distinctive illustrations, utterly charming and wonderfully tactile, even more so thanks to its juxtaposition with the super clean computer animation. Things are more real and have more texture in the imagination, particularly that of a child. That juxtaposition works well, and it's a lovely and charming film. But the downside is that the whole film isn't in the prince's world, as I would have loved to spend the whole running time in stop motion. It's beautiful, and if you're familiar with the book, you'll see just how much of the essence of the author's illustrations the puppets have, while being their own, much more substantial thing. We've talked before about the casting of big, or at least big-ish name actors in voiceover roles, and how it isn't necessary and it's often ill-advised, as voice acting is a different skill from acting to camera. But here, at least, Jeff Bridges is a wonderful choice for the Aviator, with Paul Rudd also working well as the older version of the Prince. I wonder if there's a little inside joke there too, in casting Paul Rudd to voice a character who at first never ages, and then after that only a little. The other bigger names, James Franco, Benicio del Toro and Marianne Cotillard, fare less well, though that's a lot to do with having so little to do, Cotillard in particular. Rachel McAdams does a fine job as the mum, but she doesn't bring any extra depth or interest to the character that a capable voiceover artist wouldn't have done. As for the rest of it though, it's just lovely and fantastic and beautiful, and I basically need to have my own little model of the prince. And all of his planet and stuff, because they're amazing. And also, just before you give me your thoughts, Scott, if you haven't already, look up the suitcase that the director prepared to send to actors to try and get them to come on board the or rather, the animator prepared to get the actors to come on board, because it's the most beautiful and amazing and over-the-top thing, just to try and get people interested in your pitch.
World famous, you say, The Little Prince. I actually hadn't heard of it until it showed up on a list for this.
Can I say so? I do say world famous because I've checked into it, and it is.
Yes.
When I first heard about The Little Prince, and I was told about The Prince, and you've read that as a child, like?
Nope.
No. Everybody's heard of it.
Nope.
I've never heard of it. It's all over the place in France. I've got this incredibly beautiful pop-up book of it in French for as my target to learn enough French to be able to actually read the book. And it's beautiful, and it's all over the place. And there's a Spanish version, there's an Italian version. It's all over the place. And like this story's been adapted like 300 times. Like, but I'd never heard of it. So it's world famous, just probably not to me and also you.
Yes. Not in Scotland, apparently. But I'm glad I saw it because I loved it. It's got a lot, I don't know if thematically, maybe emotionally, with actually Toy Story 3. There's a lot of things about growing up and leaving things behind, all that sort of stuff. That's there.
Aside childish things and things like that.
Yeah. And if Mary and Max contained 100% of the themes, feels, at least I was prepared for those, and I wasn't really prepared for them in Little Prince, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried a little bit at the end of Little Prince. It's a really charming story. I'd never heard of this before, but yeah, just the way that it all plays out is absolutely fantastically enjoyable. Really great stuff. And yes, the CG stuff is, I think you said, unremarkable. That's probably about right. It looks good enough, but it passes muster. But I think a lot of that clearly is kind of intentional.
Yeah, exactly. It's just because the third act, the CGI stuff feels better.
Yeah, it's a lot more alive in that final stretch.
It feels, it's trying to it's kind of like somewhere between the stop motion and the earlier CG stuff.
Yeah. Yes, it's a really interesting kind of clash and mesh of styles as it goes along. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it in that regard. The way that the actual technique of making the film is meshed with the narrative in that way, it's really quite innovative. And it's in service of such a lovely story with such charming characterizations and charming characters that it's difficult not to love it. Just terrific film. I'm very glad it showed up on this list, and I enjoyed it immensely. Lots of things to love in here, and I will happily revisit this in future. Great stuff.
Good. I'm very glad you enjoyed it.